Welcome everybody to MAC366. We are in week 6 territory and we are following on from last week's film, The Babadook, with a slightly rejigged structure and format. And we are going to jump into this week's session, which would have been scheduled for week 7 originally, but I brought forward, like I mentioned in the webinar. We're going to look at the film It Follows, a film that garnered quite a bit of critical attention in 2014-15 when it came out on a wide release. It's an independent horror film written and directed by David Robert Mitchell. Debuted at the Sundance Film Festival in 2014 to critical praise, and then was picked up for broader distribution and widespread circulation in the year 2015. The film follows a 19-year-old woman called Jamie, from suburban Detroit, who is stalked by a supernatural force, the titular It of the title. It begins to pursue Jay after what appears to be a consensual kind of sexual dalliance with a hookup with Hugh, her kind of current boyfriend, in the back of his car. Hugh then goes on to explain the rules of the film, the kind of the context, the exposition. What follows from then on in is, well, I'll let you enjoy that. I'll not say too much about the film's overall narrative trajectory. It's a shot with a wide and open set of camera lenses. This gives suburban Detroit quite an open and expansive feel. I mean, this is a city which is not renowned for its kind of natural beauty, but it's shot in such a kind of wide angle lens way that there are parts of Detroit which, I think just pull the viewer in and encourage the viewer to just kind of spend time like gazing over the environment and what's presented. There are definitely hints of John Carpenter in this film. There's thematically references to Carpenter's The Thing with a titular it or threat that is based inside of somebody, and that nobody kind of really knows anything about. There is a threat that is within, and there's also hints of They Live in terms of the film, with an unseen force that is controlling the environment or the lives of the protagonist. But the film that this film speaks to most readily, I think, is John Carpenter's Halloween, which I played an extract of in the video lecture this week. The opening scene in It Follows is like a homage to the opening sleepy suburban neighborhood in Halloween, which starts off with the film being that sleepy environment is completely thrown into disarray when an inexplicable murder is carried out. And I think if you were to kind of look side by side at these two films and the way in which they open, looking at the colour palette, the context, the setting, the use of sound, you'll find that these films are quite similar in some respects. And it's something the director has made explicit in terms of his reference points. I think that's kind of worth exploring in terms of why one would do this. This, I think, is only the film director's second movie. Another thing that you'll kind of pick up on if you've ever seen any John Carpenter films, particularly his kind of 1970s, 1980s and early 90s films, is the use of the kind of synthesizer on the soundtrack. This is a very melodic soundtrack, very reminiscent of the kind of keyboards that Carpenter would employ in his films. And I guess what this film evokes is a kind of nostalgic sense of the 1980s envisaged through the kind of the position of the second decade in the 21st century. And this vibe is almost one that we're very used to seeing these days, thanks to the success of popular Netflix TV shows like Stranger Things. But this film was shot and released initially a good 2 years prior to Stranger Things' critical success and its uptake. So, Stranger Things obviously made this territory home, but I think It Follows acted as a kind of a signpost to suggest that this was going to be, this era was going to be worth ploughing for nostalgic value. So let's have a little look at the responses to the film. Now, I've said it in my notes to myself that this film was a critical darling, and I think this is kind of borne out by the ways in which the critics have described responses to this film. Like I said, it was well received at Cannes at the film festival in 2014 before it got a distribution deal, and it was relatively financially successful as well. I think the budget came in at under $2 million, and it returned a healthy return of over $23 million. So it's a massive return, really, given the tiny budget. There are no big names in this film. There are no standout stars. I think the performance from the woman who plays what's her name, Marika, is phenomenal. But I'll leave it to you to decide kind of how you feel about this film. It garnered rave reviews from critics and from some audiences. I mean, I've put a few claims here up on screen. Of course, we've got a Metacritic score of 83, which makes it consistently good. The users give it a slightly lower score, which is not usually that unexpected. Over on IMDb, its weighted average is quite low at 6.8 out of 10, but still edging towards 7, which is a respectable score on IMDb. Over on Letterboxd, it's edging into the 3.6 out of 5 score territory, so it's a little bit higher than It Follows. I've given it a 4.5. I actually give it a 4 originally, but I've revised upwards given my attention to the film over time. And you'll see this critical disconnect between the fans and critics over on Rotten Tomatoes, where it has a 95% fresh Rotten Tomatoes score, but only a 66% score. So the point here is that critics and people familiar with horror found a lot more in this than, say, the average film goer. And I think in many ways this film is quite a cold and almost antiseptic film at times. There's not much in the way of dialogue or even kind of interpersonal relationships that are kind of there's a lacking sense of intimacy, I think, in this film. I mean, that's the kind of vibe I get from it. And I think it's primarily to do with the way in which the framing of the film and the shooting of the film kind of positions everything almost like one step removed. These wide angle lenses kind of give us, almost act as a barrier between us and the audience, the audience and the protagonists. So I think there is a little disconnect between the characters, and I think that might be deliberate, and if it is deliberate, why is it deliberate? So that's a question for you to think about. But a couple of quotes on screen here. I've got one from Scott Tobias. It says this is the best American horror film since the Blair Witch Project. So for 15 years, quite some praise. Kansas City Star. It Follows certainly lays claim to one of the best ever horror titles. Feels like a throwback to the heyday of 70s genre classics. And over in the New York-based Vulture magazine, David Elstein said that it's rarely ever been as scared as I was by It Follows. I mean, that's high praise, but whether or not you're going to be scared by this is I think, questionable, because I don't think the film is quite scary. I think there is a creeping element of tension in this film, and it's very well executed. But I just wanted to point out that it was very well received, and I think this film comes at a time when horror film has gone through like a mini renaissance, a mini revival. You've had successes of like films like The Babadook in roughly the same kind of period. It just comes prior to this one being released. You've had the success of the Witch as well, and there's these kind of small scale, low budget horror films that are doing interesting stories without necessarily exploiting the kind of visual aesthetics of gore and the like. So, critics have obviously spoken at great length about the film's subversive plot twists and the like. The ambient horror upturns, I think, conventions when it comes to this film. So, I think it's more of an ambient horror rather than an explicit horror. The horror is more about the inferences. But enough of what I think. Let's get to some questions for you to think about and consider as you watch this film for the first time, or at least as you watch this film afresh. So, many critics have referred to the film as being subversive, mainly in that they kind of suggest or contend that it upends many of the conventional horror tropes. Well, what tropes are being upended here, and how are they being contravened? Worth thinking about. The monster or the threat in this film is only visible to the person that it follows. What does this lack of visible threat imply? Why is it only one person can see it? What does this do in terms of the perception of the threat from others who can't see it? How does that change the relationship and dynamic between the characters? Critics frequently refer to the it of this film as being a metaphor for sexually transmitted infections, whilst others have referred to the themes addressing sexual consent, sexual violence, and contemporary sexual norms and values in an era of hookup culture. How valid are these concerns, do you think? What do you think the film is commenting upon? At a kind of at a kind of Freudian, Jungian psychological level, I think there's much to be made out of the use of water as a symbol in this film. Water symbolism is there throughout. There are beaches, there are backyard pools, there are swimming pools. Water is here for a very specific reason. How is water employed, and to what end? And why might water be an interesting metaphor for explaining what this film is about? Pay attention to the ways. Well, one of the things I hadn't already highlighted is that the it of the film, the threat, the it that follows, changes shape. The person who can see it often sees different its to other people who might fall under its spell. Why does the it take these different forms? Who are the forms? Is there any kind of connection between the form that it takes and the victim it pursues? Can we make any inferences from the little clues that we might get from Jay's life? What I'd like you to do here is pay close attention to the mise-en-scene within Jay's life. Look at her bedroom. There's a couple of sequences with Jay's bedroom, with her kind of personalised space. There are like photographs on the walls that you should pay attention to. There are little hints at interpersonal family dynamics that you should pay attention to that aren't explicitly mentioned. They're implicit in the frame. The way in which the parent or parents in this film are either absent or when they are present, they are kind of absent narratively. They're there on screen, but they're not there emotionally, or they're not there kind of in a sense of kind of being connected to anybody. So what do you think the victim and the threat, what connects those two things? And I mentioned in the kind of prelude that this film is one which kind of traverses like territory that's familiar to people who've ever seen kind of 70s and 80s films of John Carpenter. What I'd like to ask you is to kind of see if you can gauge when this film is set. It's shot in 2014, shot in 2013, but it was released in 2014/15. That's when this film is from, but can we draw on any temporal markers within the film itself? What is the film? How does the film present the year? Can we even infer the year from what we see? Have a look at some of the things that are appearing in the background in terms of the technology, in terms of the kind of cultural reference points that get mentioned, if any do. And the last thing I'd like to think about is that I think the film says something about class. This is a little bit beyond the film body and the horror kind of element that we're looking at. This is a film about the horror of the unseen within the body, I think. But the film does say something about class in its depiction of the kind of divide between a kind of suburban and inner city Detroit. I think, going beyond just looking at aspects of embodiment, there is something about classed bodies, I think, that's being commented upon here. How and why are these two spaces employed, and in what way? So there's something for you to think about today. I look forward to speaking to you on Friday.